So I just want to start out by saying I've really appreciated all the talks so far this morning, and I'm thankful to be a part. My name is Simon, and I'm a junior at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. And I study statistics and sociology. I'm going to be talking a bit about a research project that I was spending a lot of time with earlier this year, which started out as a final for a machine learning class taught by Dr. Smalley, and then her and I decided to dive in a bit deeper that next semester. So the general idea of the project is to make use of open source data on Bikeshare programs to better understand how these programs can be more accessible to traditionally underserved populations. This is especially important given that active transportation is well understood to drastically improve health outcomes for communities, in addition to the long-standing history of publicly funded transportation methods inadequately serving marginalized populations in the United States. So our research question, there are sort of two popular methods for distributing bikes in bike share systems. One that's been around for quite a long time is the docked model, where you have sort of pre-specified locations where users can pick up and drop off bikes. And then one that's been becoming more and more popular in recent years is the Dockless model, where the operator decides some area where it's fair game to drop off the bike anywhere inside that area. And so our central question is whether either of these models result in more similar accessibility for populations that have been historically underserved by public transportation. There's no empirical research on this question to date, or at least until the date of our working on this project. But the research around either of these models in isolation propose some different mechanisms that might affect the comparative access. A really important one for the docked model is that these stations cost something along the lines of $50,000 each, and especially if you're thinking about building a station in Midtown Manhattan in New York City or something like that. The placement is highly consequential, both in terms of financial investment and also for the resulting equity. Something to think about with the dockless systems that has been brought up a few times in the literature. Redistribution methods are really important. So, for example, I grew up around an hour away from Kansas University, and Kansas University is on a hill, so students were sort of taking the bikes from the top of the hill and riding them all the way down to the bottom of the hill. And then they started needing to employ people to throw the bikes in the back of some vans and bring them back up the hill. So you can imagine in a greater city setting, there's a lot of influx towards the downtown areas during the day, and they need to redistribute the bikes in some way. So you can imagine that could either skew towards richer areas, or they could be having equity in mind when they're doing that. So different papers made different conjectures, but the question was still sort of up in the air. In terms of the data we use, so it all sort of starts out with this unreal coordinating effort called the GBFS. This is brought about by NABSA, which is the North American Bikeshare Association. They put together this common spec for releasing data about these systems. It's all streamed live as JSON feeds, and so it only contains information about the present moment. A year or two ago, I wrote an R package to interface with this data in a tidy way. So a little shameless plug, if you're interested, that package is on Crant. But the first data set contains data resulting from querying every bike share program in the US. So we ended up with around 45,000 rows, where each row has the coordinates of a bike, as well as whether that bike is stationed or parked somewhere in like the place that the bike was parked that's not at a station, as well as some other system metadata. And then our second data set was from this super cool project called Opportunity Insights. So they have all sorts of really useful and important geospatial social data. And the data that we used was at the level of observation of a census tract. So there's all sorts of variables on the breakdown of master statuses and other community characteristics So to put together the final data set, we reverse geocoded, I think it's reverse geocoded, the direction is always weird to me, the GBFS data to the census tract level, and then aggregated so that we had a count of free bikes and a count of station bikes per census tract, along with all sorts of community characteristics of that tract. So just to get a sense of what this data looked like, each of these dots represents a bike share program. So the size of the program is mapped to the size of the dot, and the type of the program is mapped to color. So you could make a few different arguments about the way these are distributed, but in general, it's pretty representative of population density in the US. As a narrative, this is kind of a pretty classic Poisson process. And as always, those assumptions are a bit more complicated in reality. So if you're interested in that decision making, there's some discussion in this source code that I'll link to in a second. But essentially, we're trying to predict the number of bikes in the census tract based on some demographic predictors reflecting main master statuses in the US. A dummy variable controlling for zero inflation, so whether or not there's a bike share system operating in the county, whether we're predicting the number of station bikes or free bikes, and then interaction terms fitted onto that distinction. So that's where that comparative equity bit comes in. So Dr. Small and I have sort of thought of the contributions of this paper in two different categories. The first is about the methodology. So the acquisition and the tidying of the data is now as simple as just running a few lines of R code. And so we hope to see this enabling further research with this truly amazing source of data. And the second set is the actual results of the analysis. So first, there's the main effects, which reflect past research. In general, less educated and poor communities have less access. And when controlling for these, race often doesn't seem to play a significant role. It's important to note here that due to historical and continuing forces of oppression and marginalization, these three variables are highly collinear in the US. So it's absolutely true that in general, less white communities have less access. There's also the interaction terms, which tell us that these operation models differ greatly in spatial access in regard to education. So less educated communities are better served by Dockless systems. We didn't detect significant effects otherwise comparatively between the two operating models, but we do note that education is highly tied to race and class in the US. So it might feel like this analysis brings up as many questions as it's answered, and there's certainly much more to be done here to develop some real social understanding. One bit that's most exciting to me is starting to accumulate some historical data. So you can imagine setting up some automated cron job sort of thing that sends this query out every 5 minutes or something. And you could, very quickly develop some serious big data sort of vibes. I've brought this up several times already this morning and do so many times in the paper as well. We fitted our models on these specific master statuses, so race, class, and education, that are very collinear, highly intertwined in the US. And this is a pretty major discussion we've been having with reviewers so far, and it's definitely one worth having, is whether to use deprivation indices that try to capture the quote-unquote sum of these three things, and what that means for making data-centered social arguments in a thoughtful and in a socially conscious way. So I've dropped a couple more thoughts here, but in the interest of time, here's some resources and useful links I've mentioned throughout this talk. And with that, thank you, and I'd like to open up the floor for questions.
Great. Okay, Simon. So our first question comes from Misty Grave asking, does the bike sharing program include scooters?
So this data does not include scooters.
Do you think there would be something systematically different about the scooter programs than the bike programs that would lead us to a different conclusion?
Yeah, I mean, so from my understanding of the way uh, the scooters have been distributed, it's almost um, completely around the dockless model. Um, and in general, the dockless model has received a lot more pushback from governments and organizations about, people are just leaving these things in sort of ridiculous places. And maybe that's more possible for scooters because they're, easier to move around or whatever. But in general, the biggest concern around the dockless model is whether people are bringing these bikes or scooters um, with a bias, like when they're returning them to a place, is there a bias towards leaving them in richer neighborhoods, which, as a consequence in the US being much more safe?
Yeah. Okay, another question someone asked is what inspired you to work on this project?
I think there's a few things here. So um, I had been working on this software for a while. So part of it was, seeing really how much I could do with what I had built. Um, I think another bit there is that I had seen a lot of sort of superficial use of quantitative social data so far in a lot of data science research that was sort of marginally social. And so I thought it would be like a really important skill to develop to be able to make these social arguments in considered in a thoughtful way.
Yeah, great. All right, thanks so much, Simon.